On a quiet morning, Officer Ben Carter's routine patrol takes an unexpected turn when he discovers a tiny black baby abandoned in a trash heap. His heart races as he rushes the baby to safety. But little does he know, this moment will lead him down a dangerous path. Years later, a shocking call from the FBI turns everything upside down. The boy he saved is now at the center of a criminal investigation, and the truth about his past is darker than anyone could have imagined. Who is Elijah, and what secrets does his DNA hold? The answers could change everything. Forever. If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. Officer Ben Carter had been a cop for over a decade, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to encounter on that early morning shift. The sun had just started to rise, casting a pale yellow glow over the quiet suburban streets. The air was cool and still, and Ben had a feeling it was going to be an uneventful day. He had no idea how wrong he was. As he drove down the empty road, his patrol car hummed softly against the pavement. His radio crackled with the usual calls, routine traffic reports, a few minor disturbances, and the occasional request for backup. It was just another morning in the small town, or so it seemed. But then something caught his attention. A faint sound, like the soft whimper of an animal or the distant cry of a child, reached his ears. Ben's instincts kicked in immediately. He wasn't one to ignore a potential danger. The sound was coming from an alley just off the main road, a place that was usually quiet but known for being a bit rough around the edges. He turned the steering wheel, guiding his car toward the alley. The sound grew louder, and as he got closer, he realized it wasn't an animal. It was the unmistakable cry of a baby. His heart skipped a beat. In all his years of service, he had never responded to a call like this. His hand gripped the steering wheel tightly, and he parked his car quickly at the edge of the alley. He stepped out of the car and walked cautiously toward the sound. The alley was narrow and littered with discarded boxes and bags. The air smelled of garbage, but there was something else in the mix, something that made Ben's heart race. As he moved deeper into the alley, he spotted it. A small, black infant, lying alone in a trash heap, barely moving, barely breathing. Ben froze for a moment, shocked by the sight. It was impossible to fathom how a child could end up in such a place. But there was no time to waste. Instinct took over, and he rushed toward the baby, kneeling down to check its condition. The infant was barely clinging to life, its tiny body trembling and covered in dirt. It looked as though it had been abandoned with no care, no protection. Ben's heart ached for the child. "Hey there, little one," he murmured softly, trying to soothe the baby as he gently lifted it from the trash. His hands were steady, despite the shock running through him. He wrapped the child in his jacket, trying to keep it warm, and immediately pulled out his radio to call for backup. "This is Officer Carter. I need an ambulance and all available units to my location now." He spoke into the radio, his voice firm but laced with urgency. He knew every second counted. While waiting for the ambulance to arrive, Ben couldn't help but look down at the fragile little face in his arms. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. How could anyone leave a helpless baby like this in the cold, surrounded by trash? The question burned in his mind, but there was no time to dwell on it. The baby needed help. The minutes felt like hours as he waited for the paramedics to arrive. Finally, the sound of sirens filled the air, and within moments an ambulance screeched to a halt in front of him. The paramedics rushed out, their faces grave as they assessed the situation. "What do we have here?" one of the paramedics asked as he knelt beside Ben. "Abandoned baby. Barely alive," Ben replied, his voice tight with emotion. "I found it in the trash. You need to get it to the hospital fast." The paramedics nodded, quickly taking over from Ben and carefully transferring the baby to their stretcher. One of them looked at Ben with a solemn expression. "You did the right thing, officer. We'll take it from here." Ben watched as the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle sped off, its siren wailing into the distance. For a moment, he just stood there, trying to process what had just happened. He had seen a lot in his line of work: robberies, accidents, even violent crimes, but Never had he seen something so heart-wrenching. How could someone do this to a helpless child? The authorities soon arrived at the scene, including social services, to investigate the circumstances surrounding the baby's abandonment. They quickly took control of the situation, ensuring the baby was cared for. Ben gave his statement and answered their questions, but his mind kept going back to the same question. Why? The media soon picked up on the story, and the news spread like wildfire. It wasn't long before the public began to rally behind the story of Officer Ben Carter, the cop who saved a baby from the trash. People sent in donations, gifts, and offers to help. But Ben remained focused on one thing: the baby's future. As the days passed, the town began to heal from the shock of the discovery. The baby, now named Elijah by the foster care system, was placed in a loving foster family, the Matthews. Officer Ben kept in touch with the family, checking in on Elijah every so often. It was clear to him that Elijah had a long road ahead, but he had a future now, something he might not have had if it weren't for the officer who found him in the trash that morning. Yet, even as time passed, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that this story was far from over. There were still so many unanswered questions, and something told him that the mystery of Elijah's past had only just begun to unfold. Little did Ben know, his life, and Elijah's, were about to change, in ways they could never have imagined. As the months passed, the town slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. The news story about the abandoned baby, Elijah, faded from the front pages and life went on. But for Officer Ben Carter, the memory of that early morning in the alley never left him. He couldn't stop thinking about the child he had rescued from the trash. How could anyone abandon such a fragile life? It haunted him, and it seemed like every time he closed his eyes he could still hear the faint cry of that baby. Elijah, now in the care of the Matthews family, was a lively and happy child. The Matthews, a kind-hearted couple who had been fostering children for years, treated him like their own. They gave him love, safety, and the stability he needed to grow. As Elijah grew older, he became an energetic, bright boy with a love for reading and a talent for drawing. The Matthews family marveled at how well he was doing considering the rough start he had in life. But deep down, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Elijah's story than anyone knew. Officer Ben would visit the Matthews family occasionally, just to check in and see how Elijah was doing. He had grown attached to the boy in ways he couldn't explain. He'd watch Elijah play soccer in the yard, his laugh infectious as he chased after the ball. Ben couldn't help but smile as he watched. It was hard to believe that this was the same child he had pulled from a garbage heap so many years ago. Yet Ben's feelings were mixed. While he was happy to see Elijah thriving, he couldn't ignore the nagging question that had been with him from the very beginning. Where did Elijah come from? Who had left him in that trash heap, and why? One afternoon when Elijah was about 10 years old, the answer to that question began to take form in the most unexpected way. The Matthews family received a letter from the FBI. It wasn't a letter they had ever imagined getting, and as they read the contents, they were left stunned and confused. The letter demanded that Elijah undergo a DNA test as part of an ongoing investigation. It didn't explain much, but it referenced a case of child trafficking that the FBI had been investigating for years. The Matthews were left reeling. Why would the FBI need a DNA sample from Elijah? He had been with them for nearly a decade, and he had been through so much already. They immediately contacted Ben, who was just as bewildered. He had always wondered about Elijah's past, but now the mystery seemed even deeper. Ben knew the FBI wouldn't just ask for a DNA sample without a reason, but he had no idea what they were hoping to find. After some initial confusion, Ben and the Matthews learned that the FBI had been investigating a major child trafficking ring. The operation had been running for years, and it involved the trafficking of infants across the country. It turned out that Elijah's case was connected to this operation, though no one knew exactly how or why. As Ben sat down with the Matthews to discuss what had just happened, the weight of the situation grew heavier with each passing minute. They're not just asking for a DNA test. They're trying to solve a much bigger puzzle, Ben said, his voice tinged with concern. Elijah's Foster mother Mary looked at him with a mixture of confusion and fear. Do you think they believe Elijah was part of this trafficking? I don't know, Ben replied honestly. But we have to find out what's going on. Something doesn't add up. With no clear answers, the Matthews agreed to the DNA test, though it felt like an intrusion into their peaceful life. Elijah, too, was confused but trusted the adults in his life. He had always known he was different, that his life began in a way that most children couldn't imagine, but he had never dwelled on it, not when he had so much love and care from the Matthews. As the DNA results were processed, Ben could feel the tension building. The investigation was now officially connected to Elijah, and the answers seemed just out of reach. Was he part of a dark and twisted network? Or was there another, more innocent explanation for his abandonment? Days turned into weeks, and the anticipation was unbearable. Ben's curiosity grew stronger, and so did his need for answers. He decided to dig deeper into Elijah's past, thinking that perhaps his knowledge of the case could help unravel the mystery. He began to visit old police records looking for any lead that might tie Elijah to the child trafficking operation. He even spoke with detectives who had been involved in the case. What Ben found shocked him. There were records of children being taken from their homes, sometimes without the parents' knowledge, and sometimes with the parents unaware of the dangers they were in. It seemed that Elijah's birth mother had been one of the victims, a young woman who had been coerced into giving up her baby under false pretenses. The trafficking ring had promised her help, and in exchange, she was forced to give up her son. Ben felt sick as he read through the records. This wasn't just a story of an abandoned child. It was a story of a broken system, a system that preyed on vulnerable individuals and tore families apart. But at the same time, Ben felt a sense of relief. Elijah wasn't part of the ring, and he wasn't abandoned out of malice. It was an unfortunate chain of events that had led him to that trash heap on that fateful day. As the days wore on, the DNA results finally arrived, and with them came the unexpected confirmation. Elijah's biological mother had been found, and she had been part of a larger web of victims. She was now working with authorities to piece together the full story of how the child trafficking operation had operated. Elijah's past was dark, but the truth was finally coming to light. Now more than ever, Ben knew he had to stay close to Elijah. The boy who had been abandoned in the trash was no longer just a victim. He was a survivor, and his story was far from over. The days following the arrival of the DNA results were filled with anxiety and anticipation. Ben Carter, who had spent years keeping a watchful eye over Elijah, now found himself struggling with a sense of urgency. He had always felt a connection to the young boy, but now the stakes had never been higher. The more he delved into the investigation, the more layers of mystery emerged and the deeper the story seemed to run. Elijah, now 10 years old, had always been an intelligent, thoughtful child. Though he had grown up in a loving home with the Matthews family, the truth about his past loomed over him like a shadow. He had always known that his life began in a place of hardship, but he had never fully understood the gravity of it. To him, his parents were the kind, older couple who had adopted him and raised him with love, warmth, and care. But now, as the FBI continued to investigate his origins, Elijah found himself grappling with a new identity. The boy who had once been so secure in his family now wondered if he had ever truly belonged. One quiet afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows over the Matthews' backyard, Ben decided it was time to tell Elijah everything. He had been putting it off for weeks, hoping the situation would resolve itself. But it was clear now that Elijah deserved to know the truth. He sat down beside the young boy on the porch, looking into his eyes, which were filled with curiosity and the occasional flicker of confusion. "Elijah," Ben began gently, "there's something important we need to talk about." Elijah shifted nervously on the steps, sensing that this conversation wasn't going to be like the others. He nodded, his young face set with determination, as if preparing for something he wasn't entirely ready for. "I know you've been wondering why the FBI is involved in all of this," Ben continued, "and why they need your DNA, and I know that it's been hard not knowing why you were abandoned that day." Elijah's expression softened as Ben spoke. The question that had been bothering him for so long was finally being addressed. The truth is, you're not just a boy with a strange beginning. You're part of something much bigger, something that's been happening for years. Ben paused, carefully considering how to phrase what he had discovered. He could see the confusion in Elijah's eyes as he processed the information, and he knew that breaking it to the boy gently was crucial. Your biological mother. She was one of the victims of a child trafficking ring. She had no choice in what happened to you. She was manipulated, coerced into giving you up, and you were left to be trafficked. That's why you were abandoned. In the trash. Elijah's eyes widened as he absorbed this revelation. The idea that his life had been manipulated before he even knew what it meant to live was difficult to fathom. The words hung in the air between them like a heavy fog. But Ben's voice remained steady. What does that mean for me? Elijah asked softly, his voice small. Ben sighed, wishing there were an easy answer. He shook his head slowly. It means your past is filled with pain, Elijah, and that's something we can't change. But it also means that you're not alone. You're not defined by the circumstances of your birth. You have a future, a family that loves you, and now we have the truth. Ben watched as Elijah absorbed the weight of the words. The boy's gaze turned to the ground, and for a moment, Ben wasn't sure if he had made the right decision in telling him. But then, Elijah looked up, his expression full of determination, a spark in his eyes that Ben had seen countless times before. Then we find her, Elijah said quietly, his voice stronger now. We find my real mom, don't we? We find out what happened to her. She didn't leave me because she wanted to. Ben nodded, his heart swelling with pride for the boy who had so bravely faced his past. Yes, Elijah, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to find her, and we're going to make sure she's okay. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Ben and the Matthews family worked tirelessly with the FBI to track down the woman who had given birth to Elijah, a woman named Jessica Williams. The search was painstaking, involving countless interviews, records checks, and a trail of leads that often seemed to vanish just when they thought they were getting closer. Finally, after weeks of searching, the breakthrough came. The FBI had located Jessica, and they found her living in a small town several hours away. She had been in hiding, living under an assumed name, afraid for her life after being targeted by the traffickers who had exploited her. Ben and the Matthews family were informed that Jessica had agreed to meet with them. A sense of urgency filled the air as plans were made to arrange the meeting. Elijah's excitement mixed with apprehension. What would she be like? Was she the person he had always imagined? Would she be the mother he had longed for? Or would the story of his past continue to be filled with pain? On the day of the meeting, Ben, the Matthews family, and Elijah arrived at a small, modest house on the outskirts of the town. The moment they stepped out of the car, Elijah's heart began to race. He had no idea what to expect, but he felt a sense of hope rising within him. Inside the house, they were greeted by a woman with tired eyes but a warmth in her smile. Jessica Williams looked older than Elijah had imagined, the years of hardship etched into her face. She was not the strong, confident woman he had hoped for, but instead she was a broken woman who had been through too much. Elijah stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm Elijah," he said softly, his voice full of emotion. "And I'm here to understand." Jessica's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the boy she had given up all those years ago. She stepped forward and wrapped him in an embrace, whispering, "I never wanted to leave you, Elijah. I'm so sorry. You were taken from me. But I promise you, I never forgot you." The reunion was bittersweet. Jessica explained how she had been coerced into giving up Elijah, and how the traffickers had torn her life apart. She had spent years searching for him, never giving up hope, even though the world had tried to silence her. In that moment, Elijah understood that while his past had been filled with darkness, there was hope for the future. The two families stood together, united by a bond that went beyond blood. It was a story of survival, of healing, and of the unbreakable bond between a mother and a son. The reunion with Jessica Williams was only the beginning of a new chapter in Elijah's life. While the road ahead was still uncertain, the first steps had been taken and they felt like giant strides toward healing. Jessica, a woman who had once been lost and broken by a system that exploited her, now found herself facing her past and seeking redemption. Elijah, on the other hand, stood at the crossroads of a future he never expected, one where he had both a mother and a family who had raised him with love. But despite the warmth of the moment, there was much to process, and the scars of the past run deep. After the emotional reunion, Jessica moved into a small apartment in the town where Elijah had grown up. With the help of the Matthews family, she began to rebuild her life. Elijah, now older and wiser beyond his years, was determined to understand not only the history of his biological mother but also to ensure that his relationship with her grew stronger with time. They began to forge new memories, slowly unraveling the years lost in between. However, life was not as simple as just picking up where they left off. There were questions that needed answers. Questions about the child trafficking ring, about why Jessica had been coerced into giving him up, and about how they could find the others who had been victims like her. As the investigation continued, the FBI unearthed disturbing details. It was revealed that the ring Jessica had fallen prey to had been operating for over a decade, trafficking infants to various underground networks. Jessica's story was just one of many, and though it was an important breakthrough in the case, it only scratched the surface of the horrors that had been happening for years. One afternoon, as Elijah sat with Jessica and Ben Carter in the local cafe, he finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind since they had met. "Mom, why didn't you tell me about this before?" Elijah asked, his voice heavy with emotion. "Why did you stay away for so long?" Jessica looked down at the table, her fingers twisting nervously around her coffee cup. She had never been able to provide a clear answer to that question, not even to herself. She had spent years trying to forget the past, burying it under layers of shame and fear. But now, facing Elijah and the Matthews family, she knew that it was time to face the truth, no matter how painful. "Because I was scared," she whispered. "I was scared of what I might have to relive, and I didn't know if I could be the kind of mother you deserved. I thought I was protecting you by staying away. I thought if I kept my distance, you would have a better chance at a life that was free from the horrors I'd known. But I see now that I made a mistake." Tears welled up in Elijah's eyes as he reached across the table to take her hand. "It's okay, Mom," he said softly. "I don't need to know everything all at once. I just want us to be together now." Ben, who had been listening quietly, couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration for both Elijah and Jessica. They had both been through unimaginable hardships, and yet here they were, trying to rebuild their lives in the best way they could. He had seen so many cases in his career, some of which were heartbreaking, but this story of survival, forgiveness, and healing, was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. But even with the love and support surrounding them, there was still the question of justice. The FBI was working relentlessly to take down the remaining members of the trafficking ring. Jessica was set to testify in court, her testimony a crucial part of the investigation. She was scared, frightened of reliving the trauma and the danger that came with exposing the criminals responsible for tearing her life apart. But Elijah and Ben stood by her, promising that they would face whatever came together as a family. In the months that followed, the investigation revealed shocking details about the scope of the trafficking ring. Several more victims were identified, and the law enforcement community began to close in on the perpetrators. Some were arrested, others were still at large, but Jessica's bravery had made a difference. She had become a voice for the voiceless, a symbol of strength and resilience. Elijah, too, found his own strength through the process. He learned to speak out about his experience not just for himself, but for the countless others who had been silenced by fear. On the day Jessica was scheduled to testify in court, Elijah sat with her in the courtroom, holding her hand tightly. It was the first time he had seen his mother so vulnerable, Yet she was determined to face the past head-on. Ben, who had always been there for Elijah, stood at the back of the courtroom, ready to offer his support. As the trial began, Jessica took the stand, her voice trembling but strong. She spoke of the manipulation, the deceit, and the horrors she had experienced. She talked about the day she was coerced into giving up Elijah, the guilt that had haunted her, and the hope that one day she would be able to make things right. Her testimony was powerful, and it helped convict several key figures involved in the trafficking operation. The case was far from over, but for the first time in years, Jessica felt as though she had reclaimed a part of her life. Elijah, too, felt a sense of closure. He had found out the truth, and he had a chance to build a relationship with the woman who gave him life. As the trial ended, the Matthews family, Ben and Elijah, gathered at the cafe to celebrate. The weight of the past still lingered, but it no longer controlled their lives. Elijah had a future ahead of him, one filled with hope and possibility. And though the road had been long and filled with pain, it had led him to a place of healing and understanding. Ben, who had been a steady presence in Elijah's life from the very beginning, looked at the young boy now standing tall beside him. "You're stronger than you know, Elijah," he said, a proud smile on his face. "You've faced your past and come out stronger for it." Elijah smiled back, his eyes shining with newfound confidence. "We've all come a long way, haven't we?" Jessica, looking at her son with tears in her eyes, nodded. "We have, and we're only just getting started." The story of Elijah's rescue, his painful past, and his eventual reunion with his mother wasn't just a tale of survival. It was a testament to the power of love, forgiveness, and the strength to face even the darkest of pasts. Elijah's journey had been long, but it had led him to the most important truth of all, that he was not defined by his past but by the choices he made to build a better future.